Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to my studio. Today we are painting this beautiful pink peony. I saw it in a gardening video and I had to give it a try. For today's supplies, I am using a number 8 round brush, a pencil, a lid of a spice jar, and an eraser. For the lid of the spice jar, I'm using it to trace a circle. You can hand draw a circle if you'd like. I just like to trace as it's easier for me. I don't always draw the best circles by hand. And then the first thing I'm putting in is a large petal that takes up most of the area of the circle, but leaves a sliver around the top and the sides. And then for the second petal, I start it from the first petal so that it looks like it is overlapping the second petal, and then just a little swoop for the third, and then the last petal on that side is even thinner, and at the very top it kind of looks like you can see the inside of the petal a little bit. And then for the other side, for that next petal, I'm following the round shape of the circle coming around, and then for the next two petals, I'm kind of following that same shape, that same swoop, and they're not perfect, they're not exactly even on both sides. I probably could have put another petal on the left-hand side, but I like how it's not perfectly symmetrical. And then I'm putting in these two forms, which I'm not sure if they're considered petals or not, because they're a different color from those main outer petals of the peony. They're green, so they might just be part of the peony when it's in bud form, and then it falls off as it blooms. So I add those in, and then the stem and the little bits that come off, the little green bits underneath. I do not have the scientific names written down for all the parts, so I apologize. But then the little tiny, I know they're not petals, they're called something like petaloids or something similar to petals in the very center of the peony. And there are those squiggly, fluffy petals of the anemone style of peony. There are so many different styles and forms of peonies, but for the anemone form of peony, it has those large, more rounded outer petals, and then they have almost like confetti-like, just a fun party in the middle of all just a splash of squiggly, thinner petals in the center. So I don't spend much time drawing them petal by petal in the center. I just give a hint of that like curly top of those petals. Then for the initial painting of the first petal, I start with water first, and I leave the inside towards the bottom center part of the petal dry. So water just coming down around the outside edge of that petal where I'm putting the pink here. And that pink color is called Madder Rose, which makes a very nice pink. I'm bringing it all the way down to the bottom of the petal, leaving the dry area just the paper white, and then going in with a little bit of cadmium deep yellow, but you can use any yellow that you have, and filling in the area with the yellow, and then while it's still wet, dabbing in some of my bright green. Again, you can use any green that you have. I'm using the Rosa Gallery Botanical 28 colors. So the bright green that I have is called bright green, but any bright green will do. And then I decide that the colors are not as rich as I would like, so I just go over them again with that same Madder Rose over the pink area. I add in more of the cadmium yellow, and then I don't add more green in it at this point, but I will go in and do that later. Then for the next petal, I'm doing it in the same way, where first the water around the edges, leaving a bit of dry white paper area in the center, and then adding the madder rose, and then going in with some of that cadmium yellow in the center. I had a bit too much paint, so I'm using my brush as a sponge by drying it off on the paper towel, and I picked up some of that paint so that it's a little bit lighter down towards the base of the flower. And then for the next petal, I'm doing it the same way, where I paint in the water first, and then I'm adding in that madder rose all around the outer edges of the petal. Then washing off my brush and going in with yellow towards the bottom of the petal. If you've watched my previous videos, you've seen how I usually use a ceramic dish that I really like, a ceramic palette, and I like to make washes and use it that way. This time I'm making little puddles of color on a ceramic plate. So it's the same technique, I'm just using a different material. So I'm using a plate instead of the ceramic palette with where I usually make the washes. I'm just mixing it up a little bit. No real reason, except that I thought it was a little bit easier to show you all of the colors on the plate that I'm using, as well as the water and the little washes of color or the little puddles of color that I'm making, so you can see all of the different parts, whereas sometimes I feel like I cut that out of the scene a little bit, and I just wanted to make sure that you could see everything that I'm doing. So for all of the other petals that I've added, I'm doing them the same way, where I started with the water and then added in the madder rose and then the cadmium yellow. I'm trying to keep it a bit looser, a bit more free, and allow the colors to mix together and not be too detailed or intricate with this one. So for those, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It's like petal lobes in the center, but for those little thin petals in the center, I'm using that same madder rose. And then I almost forgot about this very last petal. So I put a light wash of madder rose first, just because I still had some of the paint on my brush, but you could just do water first, and then I'm putting in the madder rose and then a little bit of the yellow to that last outer petal that I almost forgot about. And then I go back in with more of that madder rose on those squiggly ball of petals in the center. And I'm not putting in a lot of detail. I'm just squiggling my brush around, making different shapes, different, I guess, almost like little circular shapes in there to give you the idea of those petals without going into great detail. One thing I do make sure to do to give it more interest is I have the darker shade of that madder rose, so there is more paint on the brush for the darker areas, and then the lighter areas that you see here where there's mostly water on the brush and just a little bit of paint. Now I'm making a puddle of yellow for the wash to use on those outer, very outer petal-like structures, as well as the stem, and I will paint in the leaves with it as well. Before doing this, I made sure that the petals were dry enough so that the yellow did not seep in too much into the petals, but I think that would be a very pretty look as well. You don't need to wait for the petals to dry if you don't mind the yellow seeping into them. For the shape of the leaves, I spent some time looking at the peony leaves in my garden, and I saw that they, a lot of the times, have 3 leaves together towards the top of the leaf, and then more leaves towards the bottom. So for this one, I have those 3 leaves at the top, and then I'm painting in 2 at the bottom, and I'm mixing a bit more of that yellow wash. I guess that's one drawback to not using my regular palette that I use, where I fill up the little areas with wash, is I'm not as used to using a puddle of wash, so it's harder to gauge how much I have to work with. So make sure you made yourself a big puddle, if you're doing it this way, a big puddle of yellow wash so that you don't run out. You can always mix more, add in more though, of course. And this puddle of wash is a bit brighter yellow. I added more yellow to it as I want it to shine through beneath 2 more layers of color that I'm going to be putting down. So this yellow wash layer is the first layer of color, and then when it's completely dry, we'll be putting on another layer of color, waiting for that to dry, and then putting on a 3rd layer of color. So for this yellow to shine through as much as I want it to give it those leaves that glow, I just made sure to add in a bit more of that cadmium yellow to the water, so this wash is a bit thicker. It's not tea consistency, it's a bit thicker than that. So for the leaves on this side of the peony, I'm again starting with the 3 leaves, and for this leaf, that's all it will be. It will be those 3 leaf shapes, and then I add in 2 more leaves towards the bottom, mixing up a bit more of that yellow. And I feel like this balances out the image of the peony, balances out the painting so that it looks like the right side and the left side, both sides, either side of the stem, that it's balanced. So let's say if you were looking at it, it wouldn't look like it was about to tip over with one side being heavier than the other side. This way it looks balanced to my eye. And then I'm going over the petal-like shapes at the top with some yellow of the yellow wash so that I can add green into it, and it will blend in while it's still wet in a very soft manner. When the watercolor blends in together wet on wet, you don't get those harsh drying lines. It blends in a soft way that I really like. So I re-wet the area and added more of that yellow wash to it, or yellow paint to it, and then went in with the bright green. And that way the 2 colors are blending in together nicely, wet on wet with the soft look. And then I'm going over the yellow stem, which has pretty much dried, with the bright green. I then dab the paintbrush right into the green paint so that it's a thicker, more rich color, and go along that left-hand side to give it a bit of a shadow to make it look a bit more 3-dimensional. Then I mix more of the thinner, more of a wash of green, and you can see I'm mixing it right next to the yellow, so some of that yellow is mixing into it, which I am happy with. And I'm going over the yellow that is dry, that first initial painting of the leaves with the green. And this way you can see how that yellow first layer is showing through the second layer of watercolor, and it's kind of giving it a glowy, warm look. And then I dab right into the pan of that green and go along the bottom of the leaves to give it a more of a three-dimensional look, so it looks like there's a bit of shading, and then pull up with little strokes to give the leaves a bit of texture without being too detailed. As I'm not going for a realistic look, I'm trying to keep it a bit more loose. So as I go along, I'm adding more green to cover the yellow leaves, but I'm also leaving little bits of yellow peeking out here and there to give it more of a three-dimensional look, to help it look like the sunshine is hitting those leaves and there are little areas where there are highlights. I've sped the last few leaves up as they are done in the same way. For the next part, I'm wetting the area that I want to add in some darker green for shading. So first I go in with water, and then I go in with the bright green, and I'm adding a bit of a darker green area right underneath the peony, and then going into the ultramarine blue and dabbing that into the wet green to make it look like there's a bit of shading underneath the peony, as if the sun is shining down on the top of the peony and there is some shadow underneath the peony. Now that the flower of the peony has dried, I'm going in with just a little more of that madder rose and darkening a couple of the petals just to make it look a bit more balanced, as there were more dark areas on the right hand side than on the left hand side, and a couple of those main outer petals were just looking a bit too light to me. But you definitely do not need to be that detailed. Sometimes I can't stop myself from messing with things, but I just wanted to add a little bit more of that darker, richer color to the left-hand side. So now that the green leaves are completely dry, I go in with a bit of the ultramarine blue, and I'm adding this layer to add a bit of a cooler green, a bit of a darker green, and a bit more of a three-dimensional look for the leaves. So I painted on top of this whole leaf, and then I'm dabbed in some of that ultramarine blue on the bottom edge of it, and then I'm going in towards the top of the flower and adding, or the top of the stem, right underneath the flower, and adding a bit more shadow there too, as well as to the bottom of the stem, and then adding more of that ultramarine blue layer on top of some of the leaves to give the leaves more interest, to make them look more three-dimensional, give them some shading. And you can see that it is a ultramarine blue puddle of color, but when added on top of a green as a third layer, it just looks like a blue-green. It doesn't look like the leaves are blue. It just adds some coolness, some shading, and when you wet the entire leaf like this one and add that more of that ultramarine blue just to the bottom edge of it, it blends in with the wet on wet blending and gives it some shading. And then I'm going in up the stem just on the left hand side to give it a look of a shadow on the left hand side of the stem. and then going into more of the leaves just to give them a bit of more detail, more interest, and give those leaves a bit more weight so that it looks balanced, so that the flower looks balanced with the leaves on both sides being of a similar hue and looking as if the sun is beaming down in the garden and there is plenty of shade as well from perhaps surrounding flowers. My peony bushes, they're pretty full, and so the leaves usually have a lot of shading on them from the surrounding leaves and flowers, and so they usually look, they have that darker, cooler look to them from having a bit of shadow on them. So I think I've reached a stopping point. I'm really happy with the way this peony turned out. I hope that you are able to give it a try and create your own peony. They're just the most beautiful spring flower. Mine are almost blooming in my garden. I cannot wait. I'll have to share pictures once they have bloomed. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.